Hello and welcome to Read Read. Today I want to talk about Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. This is a story written by Jorge Borges in his collection Fictions, and Borges is no stranger to this channel. I've done a video on this book in general, which is kind of okay. It's one of my first videos, and I don't really recommend it, but I made another video talking specifically about a story of his, The Writing of the God, which I'm a bit more proud of. And so this is actually a sister video of sorts. There's another great content creator, a booktuber, Maria, over at Strange Lucidity. She actually got in contact with me and we were just chatting, and we talked about, or she recommended that we make a video about the same Borges story and just upload it at the same time. So if you're seeing this video, her video is also available, and there will be a link in the description. We talked and we ended up deciding on Pierre Menard, and how funny would it be if it was just like each of us had verbatim, word for word analysis of this story. Anyway, yeah, and so I recommend, of course, thank you for watching this video, but I also recommend you go and check out Maria's video, because if her analysis of Pierre Menard is going to be anything like her video on the circular ruins, which is the first video of hers that I watched, it's going to be amazing. She has a really great analytical style, and she's studying literature and bringing a lot of her own experience and her theoretical knowledge to the analysis. So I'm keen to watch it. It's going to be the first thing I'm doing when this video comes out. But yeah. Now, let's get started. We'll talk about Borges and Pierre Menard. The first thing I'll say about Borges is that people love this guy, and so much so that there is no want for essays or analyses of not only this story, but all of Borges. Just in looking this up, there's a great resource, by the way. I think it's called something like the Borges Institute or something like that, which is just an online collection of a lot of things related to Borges, but specifically some journal entries and articles that, there's hundreds in there. And just to give context, I Control F searched Pierre Menard, and about a dozen came up that were in English. So there's also articles that are written in, from a quick glance, there were articles also written in Spanish and French. So yeah, if you want to kind of go and learn and dig more into Borges from an analytical perspective, I'll put that link in the description. Pierre Menard, there's so much to talk about, and people have talked about this before, so there's just a couple of particular things that I'm going to focus on, and I've got some handwritten notes here, but it's such a brilliant work because it's got a great lore around it. Borges wrote this story after experiencing a kind of head injury, and he was in hospital for a couple of days, and he was kind of worried that he was not smart anymore, and he didn't want to risk writing journals or poems or anything, because he thought, if I've lost my touch, then it's just going to be utterly dejected. What I'll do is just for funsies, I'll just write a story. And then he writes Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, and it essentially kickstarts the career of one of the most brilliant short story writers of the 20th century. And so what the moral of that story is basically, I need to get my head injured ASAP. But anyway, another cool thing a friend of mine talked about in a podcast, he talked about how Borges feels like the author who, in terms of just word for word, is the most value for money, value for time. Because I was thinking about an exercise, I think Hunter S. Thompson talked about this, Hunter S. Thompson wrote, or I guess typed out word for word The Great Gatsby, and not in a just kind of like copying way, but in a transcribing and because the idea, I suppose, is that you need to think about how do you be the sort of person who's sitting at a table and has experienced so much that you can write this. And so me, coming from like a jazz music world and doing transcriptions, that whole process is obvious, but it's a bit more rare, I think, to see those word for word transcriptions being done in the literature world. And to just take a random example from, well, it's not random because I planned it, I scripted this video, but an example of a sentence from his story. If you were to be the sort of person who wrote, a monograph on certain connections or affinities between the philosophies of Descartes, Leibniz, and John Wilkins, you have to be the sort of person who's not only read all three of those people's works, but also to have come up with those connections and affinities. And so just every single sentence, Borges is so full. Like all the time you just read a short story and then you move on because a lot of them make sense and are comprehensible. But with reading Pierre Menard, after Maria recommended that we do this story, I just read it top to bottom like 5 times because I just thought, man, it just keeps coming back to it. And so completely apropos of writing or rewriting works word for word, let's talk about Pierre Menard, the author of the Quixote. What I love about this story is that it's just Borges almost being cheeky and just saying, all right, here's a paradox. A work that is being written genuinely for the first time that already exists in the world. And so the concept, if you don't know, Pierre Menard, he was an author. The narrator is a friend of Pierre Menard's. Pierre Menard recently passed away, and this narrator is just doing a kind of talking about his life and work. There's a list of works that he went through in his life, but then the narrator talks about how his main work was that he wanted to write Don Quixote word for word, but not to have transcribed it. Apparently Menard read Don Quixote when he was an infant, and he reread certain sections, but he had the memory of the book, and this is such a cool idea, but he had the memory of the book sitting in his subconscious, and it occupied the same place or the same function as the seed of a new book that is inside an author. And I just love that because Borges really is just saying, here's a paradox, I'm going to milk this, and I'm going to use as many rhetorical devices as I can think of to make you buy this. And the crazy thing is that people buy it, and there is, entire new ways of reading that have come out of and have been inspired by this short story, which is so cool because we also have the fact that Don Quixote was written almost to be the chivalric novel that satirized chivalric novels but became the best chivalric novel, and I'm sure Borges was like extremely aware of that. It's a sort of level of foresight for me that mirrors or even exceeds Gaddis knowing how people would feel about the recognitions and having scenes in the end of the book or near the end of the book of people neglecting reading a book that looks eerily similar to the recognitions. Anyway, so after the narrator tells us that that Pierre Menard wanted to do this, then he just goes through all of the process or the background and like I said, the sort of rhetorical devices explaining why and how Menard went about this. And one thing that I'll quickly mention, because I don't really have too much to say on it, the narrator of this story gave me serious Kinboat Botkin from Pale Fire vibes. And if you haven't read Pale Fire, go and do it. It's my favorite Nabokov book, as I mentioned in a recent video. And one of the interesting thing is that especially because it's someone talking about a proficient person and kind of in an admiratory way, but especially also because when we get to the end, the narrator almost lets slip that Menard wrote thousands of handwritten pages and he destroyed a lot of them, and so he says, in vain have I attempted to reconstruct them. And I don't think the narrator is meant to be as malicious as the narrator in Pale Fire, but it's still, again, just like planting seeds of unreliable narrators. And I'm thinking, the end product of Pierre Menard's Quixote is that he has 2.5 chapters, is chapter 9, chapter 38, if I remember correctly, and some parts of chapter 22. And just really quickly going over to Don Quixote, which I have read and I did make a video of, which is cool. One thing that I wanted to point out is that chapter 9 of Don Quixote is obviously not coincidentally the first big meta break in Don Quixote where it's the narrator has been talking about this battle that with the Basque that Don Quixote has been having, and then we start chapter 9 and essentially all throws up and the narrator says, oh, the story abruptly got cut off there. I need to go out and find another manuscript of Don Quixote. And so then we have the second author who's going around La Mancha trying to find the Don Quixote, and then he comes across Don Quixote as being translated by Cid Hamet Benengeli. And yeah, so just like it was a no-brainer, I think, that the one of the chapters that Pierre Menard had to write was one that had a kind of paradox, and it contained Cervantes within Don Quixote, because the second author who's going around looking for it is Cervantes. Chapter 38 is let me find the exact name, and I won't actually talk too much about it because it's actually addressed in Pierre Menard. It's the chapter where Don Quixote is talking about a discourse on arms and letters, and as Borges writes in the story, it was interesting that, of course, Don Quixote, who was a soldier, would end up coming to the conclusion that arms were more important than letters, but a modern 19th century French scholar, the idea that he would also come to the conclusion of arms being more important than letters is more fascinating to him, and so it's a richer work because of that. The fragment of the work, which I think I found, it's chapter 22. It's not mentioned in Pierre Menard, but this is when Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are sussing out the prisoners, and one of them is a man named Ginés de Pasamonte, and Ginés is talking about the fact that he's writing his book, and what I can tell, your grace, is that it deals with truths, and they are truths so appealing and entertaining that no lies can equal them. Don Quixote asks, what is the title of this book? And Ginés replies, The Life of Ginés de Pasamonte. And Don Quixote says, is it finished? And Ginés says, how can it be finished if my life isn't finished? What I've written goes from my birth to the moment when they sentenced me to the galleys this last time. And just a speculation, that's just, going back and rereading chapter 22, that was my kind of guess as to what the fragment was that Pierre Menard also wrote. Anyway, I've got a couple of handwritten notes. There's so much in this story, and again, go and read as many essays as possible on it. One of the things that I wanted to focus on, because it is mentioned relatively briefly, they are talking about so after the narrator talks about how Menard came to that same conclusion of believing in arms as opposed to letters, there's Borges writes this: Madame Bachelier sees in them an admirable, typical subordination of the author to the psychology of the hero. Others, lacking all perspicacity, see them as a transcription of the Quixote. The Baroness de Becourt as influenced by Nietzsche. To the third interpretation, which I consider irrefutable, I am not certain I dare to add a fourth, though it agrees very well with the almost divine modesty of Pierre Menard, his resigned or ironic habit of putting forth ideas that were the exact opposite of those he actually held. So I started thinking about Nietzsche, and of course, the prime idea that's coming to my mind is this idea of eternal return, and just a great nugget. Borges is so good at planting these nuggets that you're going to spend the rest of your life thinking about. I started thinking about the eternal return, and a lot of the time it seems like it's talked about as in, people are going to come back, or, reincarnated, we're going to experience these same things, and life, death, reincarnation, etc. And I started thinking about what if things like works, like texts, get reincarnated, and they get reincarnated in and through other people. And Pierre Menard talks about being a vessel for so Pierre Menard talks about how if he was immortal, it would be easy to write the Don Quixote, because it would just have to wait for it to re-emerge. But it started thinking about this idea of firstly, works kind of being reborn and going through the cycle just like we imagine souls are in people, and them coming through and being brought out again in like new writers, especially if the work already still exists in the world. And I don't know, maybe if we think about how, like, because, you know, presumably buying into the idea of reincarnation, like souls get reincarnated while their memory of them still exists in the world, so there's some degree of like a double emerging. But I was thinking about how Pierre Menard maybe offered himself up to be a vessel for the reincarnation of Don Quixote, and how he was almost able to change or adapt his life such that as much of Don Quixote came through. I don't necessarily buy that, because there's still a tormented idea, and, you know, like, why was he burning them? But again, this story is not written from Menard's perspective. We don't know what his thoughts on it were. Yeah, that was just a cool idea. I was thinking about like souls existing in texts that get reincarnated, not just people who get reincarnated. Another awesome prescient thing is so one of Menard's visible works is a work entitled, again, and my French pronunciation is gonna make you all cringe, Le Problème d'un Problème, which discusses in chronological order the solutions to the famous problem of Achilles and the tortoise. 2 editions of this work have so far appeared. The second bears an epigraph consisting of Leibniz's advice, oh gosh, I'm just going to put it up on the screen because I can't say that, and brings up to date the chapters devoted to Russell and Descartes, which is kind of cool. But I was thinking about the concept of, you know, the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, which is so obviously a paradox. Like, we know that it doesn't have any bearing on the real world, maybe, because, like, obviously space, you will eventually overcome, and, like, space isn't divided equally into fractions. Like, there are atoms, and at some point you're going to kind of cross over and you will eventually overcome the tortoise. But I was thinking about the fact that this story, which starts as a paradox from Borges' conception, and he just kind of adds as many justifications for it as possible, it just keeps coming back. People keep wanting to talk about Pierre Menard. People keep wanting to talk about and create ways of reading texts that separate the words on the page from the concept of the text, and it's just brilliant. It is such a rich work. I really can't recommend reading this story enough. I also really, again, want to just go and see what Maria at Strange Lucidity thought of this story, because we haven't talked about what each other's perspective is. We're kind of just going to wait to see. But yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy Maria's video, and I'll see you all in the next video.